The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, everyone. My name is Sherry Lynn Phelps, and I'm the Agronomy Manager with Saskatchewan Pulse Growers, and I will be hosting the webinar today. I also have Andrea Lauder, who is our Communication Manager, with us. We would like to welcome you to the Dry Bean webinar in the Pulse Agronomy webinar series. For CCA and CCSC credits, they will be available, and to get your CCA credits for today's webinar, you must be watching it live. For those who attend the webinar, Andrea will send out an email after the webinar requesting your CCA number. If more than one person is watching from one computer, you will need someone to verify those in attendance and can include all the CCA numbers. Webinars will be recorded and posted to SPG's YouTube account and the SPG website for future viewing for those unable to attend, or for those who want to look back at the material that was covered. For today's webinar, all participants will be muted. We will be happy to take questions at any time. To ask a question, please type it into the question box located in the GoToWebinar dashboard. You can send questions at any time. If the question is relevant at the moment, we will try to fit it in. Where a question can wait, we will hold until the end of the presentation. So let's get on to today's speaker and topic. Today we have Jeff Ewen, who is going to speak to us about dry bean production in Saskatchewan. Jeff graduated from the University of Saskatchewan in 2012 with a bachelor's degree in agriculture, majoring in agronomy. He spent his summer employment with Richardson Pioneer and BASF. Jeff was employed by the Ministry of Agriculture in Outlook from 2013 to 2018 as an irrigation agrologist. He maintained interest in the family farm throughout high school, university, and his career, and in the spring of 2018, he stepped away from the ministry to participate in the growth of the family farm and follow his lifelong dream of full-time farming. Jeff, along with his two brothers and father, operate a 12,000-acre irrigated and dryland grain farm at Riverhurst. Jeff brings a lot of experience with dry beans, and I look forward to his presentation. I will now turn it over to Jeff.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Sherilyn. And I have to first and foremost thank the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers for this opportunity. Dry beans has been a crop that I've been involved in for a number of years, and I'm happy to share. So dry bean production in Saskatchewan. We're looking for a pulse for every acre, and here's another opportunity. So in summary, I'm going to cover why dry beans for Saskatchewan, the growing region that is best fit here in Saskatchewan, classes and varieties to consider, field considerations, planting, pests, harvest, storage, marketing. I have some Sask grower experience as well as some research and demonstration that was done recently and is relevant. So why dry beans? Well, first of all, crop rotation. Many regions in Saskatchewan struggle with keeping a number of crops in rotation, and dry bean gives another opportunity there. And with crop rotation, you get herbicide rotation, you get a break in disease cycles, as well as it gives you an opportunity to hedge market risks. So as for instance, if canola markets decide to dip, it still gives you an opportunity with another crop that potentially has high returns. There's also new early maturing varieties coming on board, and there continues to be more and more brought every year. There's an adequate growing region here in Saskatchewan, both based on soil, moisture, and frost-free days. There's the ability to use conventional farming equipment, which I'll get into a bit later. Our cost of production here is a competitive advantage over traditional growing areas, and most of that's based on land values and rents that are going on in other regions, such as the Red River Valley or into the United States. And dry bean is also a high value commodity, so that's something that we can capture higher returns on as well. So here's a picture of global pulse production, and luckily Chuck Penner was willing to share some of his graphs, so you'll see numerous of those in this presentation. But if we look at dry bean production, it is the largest produced pulse in the world, far and away, if not double any other pulse. So that's something to consider, that there's something to capture there. Canadian pulse production, this gives a bit of a scope as to what we know, and that is that peas and lentils are the two dominant pulses currently. Chickpeas and dry beans are down near the bottom. U.S. pulse production, this gives a little bit more perspective as what the Americans are looking at, and where dry bean is far and away the dominant pulse, followed by field peas, lentils, and chickpeas. Here's the Canadian perspective on dry bean acres. So Saskatchewan is that smallest bar furthest to the left, and typically we're sitting at 10,000 or less acres. In Alberta, they get up, and these are all irrigated acres in Alberta, 50,000 acres. Manitoba, on the other end of the spectrum, is virtually all dryland acres, and they hedge up over the 100,000 acre mark. And so then in the prairies, as a total, we're over 200,000 acres. And Canadian, if you bring in the eastern side of the province, we get up over 350,000 acres in 2018. Here's the SCIC dry bean seeded acres for 2018 and the cropping districts where they're located. So they had a tally of reported acres of just over 10,000 acres in 2018. And this is the irrigation production area. So predominantly dry beans in the past have been grown in around Lake Diefenbaker under irrigation. But as you can see, there's been some spread, the southeast corner and the northeast corner where there's been some production. So here in the growing region, we look at the SCIC dryland coverage map. And this really dictates where dry beans do have the best fit in the province. This mostly due to the fact of moisture, soil type, frost-free days, and heat units. And this is the coverage area that currently SCIC will honor coverage. That being said, there is production outside these areas. And in order for us to look at expanding this area, we need to see some success in other areas. And in order to do that, we need to report our acres to SCIC, even if they can't be covered. And here's that irrigation district area, which actually has its own individual coverage that isn't covered in this dryland map, but is it covered under irrigation. So again, that SCIC coverage area really shows where in the soil regions and the RMs that are best fit, which is mostly on the top edge of the dark brown soil zone into the black soil zone. And again, most of that is dictated by the fact of needing that later season moisture. And again, that irrigation production area, which lies on the top end of the light brown soil zone and the dark brown soil zone. So classes and varieties. The biggest thing with classes and varieties is you need to discuss this with potential buyers. They're the ones that are going to be handling it after you produce it and are going to help you along the way. So you need to discuss with them what they feel is best fit based on what they're looking at for market potential and what they're willing to buy. So Viterra, Ilta Grains, Schooler, Global Grains, AGT, Rudy Agro, to name a few. Rudy Agro is Saskatchewan located. The rest mostly have receiving in Alberta or Manitoba. Varietal data is something that is very regional specific. So varieties act differently in different geographies. So you have to be really considerate of this when you're looking at data. For instance, if you're looking at plots that were put in Carmen, Manitoba, or somewhere in the northern states, they don't necessarily read true to what could happen on your own farm, especially as you move further north. We see that between moisture, day length, heat, all these things change the way that each variety reacts, and dry beans seem to be worse than any other crop in that fashion. Luckily, we have a breeding agency out of the University of Saskatchewan at the CDC that is breeding dry beans, ironically, being that we have so limited production, but yet we still hold a breeding program, and a quite successful breeding program in that produces quite a few varieties that are suited for here in Saskatchewan. And you look for that CDC label, and that's where they were produced. They're unique because they're short season, and they can survive for the most part here in Saskatchewan. So that's one thing to consider. Early maturity is definitely essential. Under 100 days to maturity is something you want to look for sure. Most dry beans are 100 plus days, and they get lumped in there with soybeans as being a long season crop. So that early maturity is essential. Upright plant structure is another thing you want to look for. So a type 1 or type 2 dry bean growing structure. So the images on the right-hand side show that the flowering and the potting happen higher up on the plant. And that is key, especially for dryland production if you're considering direct harvest. And that high pod height is the most important part. When it comes to markets, you want to look for desirable traits for those markets. So color and size are the two biggest things when it comes to dry beans. So you want to pick varieties that best suit those. Also consider secondary markets, as not every year in Saskatchewan is going to be conducive for creating a perfect edible bean. Looking at other markets for poor quality is something to consider. Also, slow to darken trait in Pinto is something to be desired, as we're on the far north reaches of the marketing edge. So our production generally doesn't get to market till later, and in those cases, oxidation can result. So the slow to darken trait allows for our beans to stay in good shape by the time they get to the market. So here's a breakdown of the different classes that are currently grown in Saskatchewan, or in Canada, pardon me. So in 2018, and really the trends are more or less the same, navy beans, black beans, and pinto beans are by far the largest produced. They are the biggest markets as it is in the world. So then you move into the smaller, with the cranberries, the kidneys, small reds, and great northerns that are on a little smaller acreage, and they are smaller markets. In the US, they're slightly different. The vast majority of what they grow is pinto beans. They also grow black beans and navy beans largely. Again, world markets, those are the three big ones, but they also grow some of the other types as well. But more than anything here is a comparison that in Canada, we grow over just 300,000 acres. In the US, they're up over 1.1 million. So substantially more acres. And when you compare those bars, they're growing more pintos than we're growing all our types. So classes and varieties specifically. Pinto beans. The two varieties that I have selected as best fit for Saskatchewan, first is CDC Marmot, which is a regular darkening pinto bean, type 1 growth habit, early maturity, moderate yield potential, and high pod set. So this was brought out of the Saskatchewan breeding program and has a good fit for here in Saskatchewan. And Vibrant is another type. It is a slow to darken, type 2 growth habit. The one thing to consider is a late maturity. So as we move north in the province, this maybe isn't the best fitted variety. It does have high yield potential, and it has a good high pod set. I do caution you when you're looking through data and different varieties, CDC Pintium is an old variety. It is originally the first variety that Saskatchewan brought to the table as potential. It unfortunately has a poor disease package and low yield potential. I wouldn't recommend that variety. CDC White Mountain 2 is a great variety. Unfortunately, it has low pod set, which is not conducive for dryland production. It works well under irrigation where we're using specialized equipment. AC Island is very much the same. I would caution growing it out on dry land, especially in a solid seeded situation or direct harvest. The Navy class, Portage would be the best variety to consider. It's a type 2 growth habit, moderate maturity, moderate yield potential, and high pod set. Another variety to consider is AAC Shock. It's a type 2 growth habit. It is a little late on the maturity, so something to consider again as you move northern. High yield potential, high pod set. It also has resistance to common bacterial blight, which is a bonus, and that being in its newer genetics. I would caution when looking at Envoy or OAC Lightning. Envoy is an older variety, again, not a very good disease package and a low yielder, where OAC Lightning is a newer, but unfortunately, being out of the Ontario program is quite a bit later and not very conducive for Saskatchewan. For black bean types, There's CDC Blackstrap. This is a type 2 growth habit, early maturity, high yield potential, high pod set, and has the resistance to common bacterial blight. So this is the most recent and the highest success the CDC has produced, in my opinion. It has a very good fit here for in Saskatchewan. There has been recent production, including on my own farm, and we're really happy with this variety. CDC Superjet is the type 2 growth habit. It has late maturity, high yield potential, high pod set, and also has resistance to combine bacterial blight. This was one of the predecessors to Blackstrap. It is a later maturing one, so I do caution that it isn't as ideal in that fashion. I would caution when using CDC Jet, Eclipse, or Carmen Black. All these varieties are later maturing. Eclipse is by far and away the largest grown black bean in Manitoba, but they have a longer growing season. CDC Jet is the predecessor to Super Jet, so it has a poor disease package, and it wouldn't consider that one. And Carmen Black is an older variety as well that is late. So some other classes, when it comes to these niche markets, I do tend to steer guys a little bit away from this, especially first-time growers. The quality is the biggest thing with these types, and they are small acreage markets, not somewhere really to start on, and a lot of the varieties are not quite tried and true. So just a few to name off. In the Florida Junio, CDC Ray. This was a recently released variety. It's a type 3 growth habit, which isn't absolutely ideal, although it's kind of unique because it's very viney, which actually helps it hold itself up, similar to peas. It is a later maturing variety, is another reason it's not that conducive at the moment. It does have high yield potential, and the pod height, from what I understand, it is higher. I haven't actually viewed it later in the season to see where those pods do end up. But if you were interested in growing this variety in this class, Rudy Agro out of Outlook, Saskatchewan has the rights to this and is doing production contracts with it. The yellow CDC Soul is a type 1 growth habit. It has later maturity as well, which is an issue, and moderate yield potential. Pod height on this, I'm not entirely sure as well, and it also is being bought by Schooler and with production contracts. In the small red category, there's AC Red Bond. It's a type 2 growth habit, moderate maturity, moderate yield potential. Its downfall is the low pod height, which could be an issue. So field considerations. Rotation is probably the biggest thing to start things off. Canola stubble, for instance, is one that I steer guys away from. Biggest reason is the stubble or is the leftover seed as volunteer can be an issue, as well as the fact that sclerotinia is the worst disease in dry bean as well as canola and can have that infection. So I try to steer guys away from using canola stubble. A well-drained field is important. So the picture on the right really orchestrates this, as Dennis Lang shared with me from Manitoba. Navy bean field compared to a soybean field. Dry beans don't like wet feet. You need to pick fields that are well drained. Soil texture is another consideration. A moderate texture is perfect. Something that can still hold moisture, but is not real heavy clay, as crusting can become a problem early on, as well as dry beans are known to be fairly weak at finding their way around with roots. You want to pick fields with minimal stones, as you're going to be working on the ground when it comes to harvest time, so that's a consideration. Weed pressure, you definitely want to pick fields that are not high in weed pressure. The herbicide options are decent for dry beans, but they definitely aren't that competitive, and we want to pick fields that are relatively clean. Herbicide residue is definitely something you got to consider as well. There's a list of several herbicides that have residue issues in the following year, so you want to review that. This is in the crop protection guide, and definitely something you want to consider as they are weak on that front. Planting. So soil temperatures, we want to look at soil temperatures that are above 10 degrees. Same recommendation as soybeans. They imbibe that warm, moist soil and helps them get off to a really quick start. We want to avoid any chance of frost in the springtime. So we tend to plant later. So between May 20th to June 7th is kind of the window to get them in so that you can miss early season frost as well as frost on the back end. In moist soils, we want to plant at 3/4 inch to 1.5 inches in seeding depth. In cases where the problem. Inoculation is, go ahead.
Are you having mic problems? You kind of cut out there.
Oh, I just seen that it disconnected and now reconnected. Can you hear me?
Yep. Okay.
Okay, good. So inoculation. Inoculation is something that has been explored. Unfortunately, there's not a lot of commercially available in Canada. Dry beans typically are not the best fixers of nitrogen. They're probably on the lowest end of the spectrum of all pulses. So we will be putting down fertilizer. Inoculant is something that we typically don't include. Land rolling is important. You want to do this prior to emergence. It's important for knocking down stones and dirt lumps. But the prior emergence part has to do with the epigeal germination of dry beans. So the cotyledons actually come above the surface. So in this case, if you were to roll after emergence, you may damage that growth point, which in turn will kill the plant. And that's the same reason that frost is an issue, because that growing point is above the ground. So when it comes to target plant populations, based on row spacing, so in narrow rows, the smaller seeded beans, so the navies and the blacks, we want to target 140 to 150,000 plants. In wider rows, 120 to 130. Pinto beans, in narrow rows, 80 to 90,000 plants, and in wider rows, 75 to 85,000 plants. Target seeding rates by population. In the smaller seeded beans, that equates to roughly 50 to 60 pounds per acre to get in our target seeding range, probably on the higher end of the spectrum. And when it comes to pinto beans, 70 to 80 pounds per acre to reach our target range. If you are planning to use the air seeder, though, you want to account for up to 25% seed damage when planting. So you have to take that into consideration with your seeding rates. Also, dry bean seed is highly variable in size, so always calculate your seeding rate using 1,000 kernel. Fertilizer requirements. In a low soil testing scenario with nitrogen and phosphate, to get into our target range of yield, which I see it to be between 1,500 and 2,000 pounds, we need between 60 and 90 pounds of actual N applied over and above. For phosphate, we want to be 30. We need to take caution when we're doing seed place phosphate, as the safe rates are more in that 20 to 25 range, depending on your soil and your moisture. And potassium, if you're low in potassium, 20 pounds per acre is recommended. Also, dry beans are one of the crops that does respond to zinc. And in cases where there's a shortage, we'll show that it's short, and you may need to apply between 3 to 5 pounds per acre of zinc. Pests, so we have weed control. Pre-plant herbicide, it's a good idea to use Edge, Treflan, or Avidex, but not all classes of dry beans are on Canadian labels, so you need to talk to your rep in your area about using these pre-plant options. I also recommend using glyphosate plus some other additive in your burn-off, depending on what your target weeds are and problems with that. But I always recommend adding something, especially since a lot of our area has some type of glyphosate resistance, or no, I shouldn't say resistance, tolerance in the crops that we grow, so those volunteers can be an issue. Permit is another product. It's a group 2 that can be used, so it keeps down flushing weeds such as volunteer canola, but we really have to watch our recropping restrictions as there's quite a few crops that can't be grown the year following. In-crop herbicide, so Viper, which is Vazagram and Solo, is the most dominant product used. There is some other products that can be used depending on what weeds you're wanting to control. And there's also several grassy weed control options that can be considered for that. When it comes to disease, Sclerotinia by far and away is the most problematic, known as white mold in dry beans. So the symptoms are wet, soft spots on leaves, stems, or pods. In the later stages, we then see the formation of white mold, which appears and rapidly spreads in moist conditions. The infected plant parts shrivel and die off. So if that's a pod, you lose the pod. If it's on a branch, you can lose the entire branch. The final stages result in black sclerotia bodies to finish off the cycle. Very much the same as in canola. The prevention for this is rotation, obviously. There is, for suppression, you can use preventative fungicides such as Cotegra, Allegro, Acapella, etc. As well as there's one contact fungicide, Oxidate 2.0, that can be used as suppression as well. Another disease is halo and common bacterial blight. The cause of this is infected seed in most cases. It results when plants get injured from hail, wind, or machinery, followed by rain, allowing for bacterial blight infection, and then it spreads using the rain splash. Symptoms, brown chlorosis with yellow margins, and greasy water-soaked lesions on leaves and pods is later infection. Suppression, you can use a copper-based fungicide such as coppercide or cocide. Best prevention is to use disease-free seed, and this is a must. All certified seed is being monitored for common bacterial blight to keep that out of the seed stream. The genetic tolerance is in some varieties such as CDC Blackstrap and AAC Shock, and that's something to watch out for. The breeders are definitely working on working that in. Anthracnose is a fungus caused by infected seed and stubble. It shows darkening veins on the underside of the leaf, stems and pod lesions with distinct dark spores in the center. Best prevention is rotation, using disease-free seed, a preventative fungicide, and in most cases there is genetic resistance to the most common strains, but something to keep an eye out for regardless. When it comes to pests, the two biggest ones are going to be cutworm and wireworm, so early on in the season, infecting seedlings. Grasshopper can be later on in the season, something to keep an eye out for, but for the most part, the insects that are going to infect dry beans in the larger growing areas are currently not here. So if you do feel like your field has issues in the past with cutworm or wireworm, suppression with an insecticide seed treatment is your best option. As we move on into harvest, our first option for preparing for harvest is swathing. So 75% buckskin pods is the recommended timing for swathing, which is when seeds are less than 30% moisture. I recommend swathing after a dew, especially if we get on the little bit drier side. But you want to pick a time when there's limited green plant material left, the leaves, stems, and pods, because those are just going to sit and potentially mold or hold moisture anyway and slow down the ripening. But the pros of swathing is you do limit your losses from shattering. When you leave the dry beans out to completely mature, the pods get very brittle, and that can create problems with shattering losses, whereas if you go into the swather, you can take them on the tough side, and your losses will be much minimal. And it also is a quick dry down option. The cons is that swaths are prone to blowing, and also rain can result in weeks before dry down. So another option is desiccation prior to direct harvest, but you have to check with your buyer before applying. Not all products, just because one place will buy treated with one product, the next may not. So if you have intentions of selling into certain markets, depending on their destinations, they do have certain products that they will not allow you to apply. So that's the first thing. But timing is very much the same as swathing, 75% buckskin, less than 30% seed moisture. Ideally, get in there prior to major leaf drop. This allows for better penetration with your desiccant, but also retention of those leaves will really help with direct harvest as it gives you more material to feed the combine. So glyphosate, Reglone, and Heat LQ are a few of the options that can be considered. There's a few more as well. This is the red outlined one here is the ideal timing, when there's still a little bit of green material, but those pods are 75% buckskin. So harvests. Beans are tough when they're greater than 18% moisture. They're dry between 12 and 16% moisture, and splitting can really become a problem once you dip below 12% seed moisture. I recommend using a flex draper for direct harvest. This will give you the best ability to get right on the ground, and the canvases help with better feeding. Air reels and duckbill reel tines are two accessories that can really help with front end losses on the combine if you have that at your ability. Recommends steel tine pickup for swaths. So there's a Sund, Pickett, or Elmer's are a few of the manufacturers that make these. So they actually have steel tines, and they tend to feed a lot better than the traditional types that come on most combines. Storage considerations. Safe storage is less than 60% seed moisture. Hopper bottom bins are recommended. A smaller bin to try and limit the drop, so in height. Aeration can be beneficial for when you're putting tough seed in the bin, but if you're putting dry seed in the bin, the ducts actually can be damaging to the seed. A conveyor is very high on my recommendation list. The damage that you'll create by trying to run through an auger probably defeats the purpose of growing dry beans, so conveyors to load and unload bins is pretty much essential. A dry bean ladder. This is something that will help you. You hang it on the top of the bin and it breaks the fall. It's something to consider. We don't actually use them ourselves. I know processors use them. The biggest thing with them is they're a nuisance when you want to clean out the bin, and if you want to use it for something else, you have to get in there and remove that and clean it. For long-term storage, oxidation can be an issue, especially with the white type beans. So pinto beans, for instance, will turn brown and become lower marketability. And if you're trying to store them tough, mold can be an issue, very much the same as peas, where molding and crusting can happen on the top. When it comes to marketing, the biggest thing you have to understand is that dry beans are very much a processor-driven industry. There's a lot of proprietary rights when it comes to seed types and when it comes to production contracts. In most cases, processors are going to want to sell you the seed, and they're going to want you to sign and buy that you will send back 100% of your production to them. So you've tied yourself entirely to them, and in most cases, they are going to put all the risk on you. So there's things to consider. That's not all bad by any means. You want to make good relationships with the processors, as they will be the ones paying and taking your production. But when it comes to markets, quality in the edible markets is definitely king. So color and size are huge. Secondary markets, there's canning markets and pet food markets. Developing, the pet food one is. Canning has long-standingly been there, and not necessarily do they have to be the most pretty to fit in there. Livestock feed, I put a big question mark behind that because dry beans have tannins in them. So this can be an issue in different livestock foods, so not necessarily is that a fit. Production contracts, a typical production contract looks like you'll be selling your first 800 or 1,000 pounds per acre with the first right of refusal on the remainder of the production, is how most of them read. But you really need to read these and discuss those contracts with your buyers to make sure you're comfortable and everything is clear with them, because there'll be a lot of detail in those, as there is with lots of production contracts. It's very much similar. So when it comes to marketing, I really wanted to display how there's several different avenues of marketing and a lot of different countries in play. So Europe and the US are probably our two biggest markets, but also you have Africa, Central America, and Asia included in that. So there's opportunity in lots of different places, which we've learned in the last number of years, that if one country decides to turn on us with trade barriers and so on and so forth, often it will result in substantial trade issues, and at the farm gate we really feel that. So this gives us some opportunity that there's a lot of different places for them to go. Now, that being said, different classes go into different areas and regions, so there can be still those effects. So now I want to move on to some Saskatchewan grower experience, and I have to thank these guys for contributing their information. So first of all, we have Blake Tebbett from Nipawin, Saskatchewan. He planted CDC Blackstraps on May 26th into oat stubble with an air seeder on 12-inch spacing. He used a seeding rate of 87 pounds per acre. He put down liquid Avidex. He burnt off with Express and Roundup. He fertilized with anhydrous, which resulted in 85 pounds per acre of N. He put down 60 pounds per acre of 1152 with the seed. His herbicide was Centurion on June 13th for grassweed control, and later came in with Viper plus Bazagran on June 25th at the optimal timing for application. He then sprayed a fungicide on July 19th at first pin bean, which is the recommended timing. Desiccated with Roundup on September 3rd and harvested on October 5th. So as you can see, there's about a month time frame there, which we're all familiar with the fact that it snowed and it rained and we didn't have a September for the most part. So his beans stayed out. He direct harvested them at 16 to 17% moisture and had an average clean out yield of 2,000 pounds per acre. His comments were that frost late in August increased his dockage and his final dockage was 22%. I have a picture of a sample coming up, so you'll see the molded and the frosted beans. He used a Macdon Flex header, which worked really great, and he harvested on a slight angle to get the best feed. He has a 4-year rotation away from canola on this field, so he felt he had no volunteer problems with canola, and he did observe some white mold late in the season. So some images of that field courtesy of Sherilyn Phelps. So this was on August 21st. As you can see, it's starting to come in, and this is in the far northeast reaches of Saskatchewan. So pretty impressive how early they came in. Here's a view of the pod set. And here's his sample, which was broken down into the different marketing considerations here. So we have on the far left side the good pure beans. The middle would be your foreign materials and splits. And then on the far right side, that's the molded and frozen, unfortunately. So again, getting into that north part and getting an early season frost, this is what some of the effects can be. So a second grower experience was Keith Nightingale from North Battleford. He planted on May 23rd into canola stubble, CDC Blackstrap, with a 15-inch planter. He targeted 135,000 and 150,000 plants per acre, burnt off with Express and Roundup. His fertilizer was 70 pounds of N, 20 pounds of P. He also put an addition of zinc. His herbicide was Viper, and he also had to go with a second pass of Bazagran due to volunteer canola. He sprayed one pass of fungicide at first pin bean, desiccated with Reglone, and harvested on September 7th. He direct harvested at 18 to 20% moisture. His average cleanout yield was 1,500 pounds per acre. Keith felt that he was short rain in 2018, definitely, but he was really happy with the early maturity. He was able to get these beans off before he seen any rain or snow. They also had all that smoke up in that part of the province, and it didn't seem to affect anything as the beans were already maturing by the time that came in. He said you definitely need to use Edge in the future. He had wild oats in his sample, which brought up his dockage, and volunteer canola was a problem in his field. So here's a few pictures from Keith through the summer. There's a field picture as it's coming into maturity later in August, and again the pod set, and a snap of his samples. So now I'll move on to research. So I worked with the government for the better part of 5 years, and I did a lot of work with dry beans, and some of these are my projects from that time. So I have to thank ICDC, the Irrigation Crop Diversification Corporation was the avenue that allowed this to happen, and the ADOPT program. So first of all, we looked at narrow versus wide rows in the plot scenario, and this ran for 3 years. And this is under irrigation, I want to mention. So we did 2 varieties and 3 classes. So in the pinto beans, we use AC Island and CDC White Mountain 2. For the blacks, we use CDC Blackstrap and CDC Jet. And for navies, we use Envoy and Portage. So the narrow row spacing was 12-inch, and plant population was 25 plants per meter square. In wide rows, it was 24-inch and 35 plants per meter square. Here's the combined data for 2016. And we were pretty surprised when we seen this data to show the significant response in all types, in all varieties for narrow row spacing. So we carried that into 2017. Slightly different year. 2016 was the tail end of the really wet years in this area, and 2017 was significantly drier, and we've seen a little bit different interaction in varieties, but the same response between narrow and wide rows. So we carried that into 2018, and 2018 was very much similar to 2017 when it came to moisture and heat, and we again had those responses and significant responses. So when we combine all that data for the 3 years, this is the response we got between different varieties and types. When it came down to across all of them, we had a 36.2% increase in yield in narrow rows versus wide rows. And this was really interesting to see. It's been shown before in other research that narrower rows do result in more yield. For the most part, this is just a fact of better seedbed utilization. What needs to be considered in this, though, is the disease side of things. In the wrong conditions, when you plant more plants in a smaller area, you're creating an environment that could be much more conducive to disease. As it worked out in the plot scenario, we didn't see that. We definitely seen a huge response to having more plants in that small area. So that ventured us in 2017 to take this to the field scale and do a full field scale demonstration. So thanks to the pulse growers as the primary funding avenue for this. We also brought on Prairie Agriculture Machinery Institute to help with evaluation. So we planted CDC Blackstrap. This is a bit of the breakdown as the wide row system versus the narrow row system. I'm not going to go through it 100% due to time, but more than anything, what I want to show here is that the regular wide row system is a 12-pass system in a year. We're going over the field a lot of times. Compared to that narrow row system, cuts that in half, depending on if you're swathing or direct harvesting. But as it worked out, other than the seeding rates and the target plant populations, pretty much the agronomy is exactly the same, and the passes with herbicide and fungicide and all that were the same. The one thing I do want to note is that our actual plant populations were a little bit out compared to what we were targeting. So with the wide rows, we were targeting 115,000, and we ended up with 142,000 plants per acre. With the narrow rows, we were targeting 125,000 and ended up with 97,000. In the narrow row spacing, the reason for the reduced plants is mostly due to using the air seeder and damaging seed is what we felt. So here's a look at irrigation precipitation for that year. So rainfall, we received 3.8 total inches, which the majority of that came in early May and into August. June and July were very little rainfall. Irrigation, we applied 7.5 inches. But this gives you a good idea as to when dry beans need moisture. As you can see, July and early August were when the vast majority of that irrigation was applied. And that is the reproductive stages. So planting took place on May 29th. So we planted with an air seeder at 10.5-inch spacing and a vacuum planter on 22-inch spacing. This was 7 days after planting on June 5th, and the seeds are already trying to break the surface. A lot of the agronomists will tell you in the dry bean world that if dry beans are planted in perfect conditions, you should see the beans within 5 to 7 days after planting, which is kind of unique for their large plant or large seed. 21 days after planting, this is June 19th, so we're seeing our first trifoliate. 35 days after planting, we're starting to fill in on July 3rd. By 50 days, we're more or less closed in. And 64 days after planting, August 1st, we're right closed in. You can see flowering happening. 85 days after planting, on August 21st, we're already starting to see black or purple beans in this case. On 92 days after planting, now we're getting very close to the end. We're starting to see the pods change color. And I want to really make note here. You can see the line in the field. This was the wide rows are on the left-hand side and the narrows are on the right-hand side. And that was a big difference. You can see it up in the upper image as well. But the green side was actually due to a little bit of delaying at the time of seeding, even though they were on the same day. But we also received a rainfall late in August that seemed to make them hold on that much longer, where the wide rows had already decided they were done. As it worked out, we undercut it on 96 days after planting on September 1st. We swathed at 100 days after planting due to that little difference in maturity. And you can see we're right on target here. There is more green material than I'd like to see, but that was due to that, again, that late rainfall seemed to make them hold on, but yet the pods were ready and we were at 75% buckskin. 106 days after planting was harvest day. So we harvested with a picket bean combine, the ones that were swathed and the ones that were undercut. So this is a specialized combine just for dry beans. And it uses a very gentle way of harvesting and really reduces your dockage. So it uses a bucket elevator and dumps into a hopper, which then that hopper is hydraulically dumped into the truck, which takes away basically all your pinch points for creating issues. We also harvested with direct harvest on that same day with Class 8 case combine, rotary combine, and a flex draper header. So our results. Biggest thing I want to point out here is the net returns. And most of the net return has to do with, one, the expenses put in, and then the yield, obviously. So dryland, we had a small portion of dryland production there where we netted $214 an acre. The straight cut portion was just about $700 an acre. And narrow row swath was just about $800 an acre, and that was about on par with the wide row custom system. So the custom system took into account custom planting, custom cultivation, custom undercutting, and custom harvesting. And this was all based off 33-cent black beans, which is in and around, well, that's where the market was in 2017, and we're slightly above that now. So observations from this experiment: current air seeder delivery systems damage seed. Agronomy seems to work with both systems, so it does the traditional way of doing it. Agronomy-wise works in that narrow row system. Tillage to facilitate undercutting only. There's no major outside benefits. It's kind of been believed that the cultivation helps with rooting and infiltration, which I think is true. It just depends on your soil type. Plant population seems to have a strong effect on days to maturity. That's up for question, but that was an observation based on the differences in the sides as well, as we felt that when we crammed those plants in there at 142,000 plants, it really seemed to speed up maturity, which was an interesting observation. Swathing reduced harvest losses, but a very delicate and challenging task. Straight harvest resulted in small losses at the header. The more material, the less losses, though, is what we observed. Bean combine much gentler on seed and a cleaner sample. Straight harvest system has much better residue management and reduced soil erosion potential. This is the biggest reason that we do want to move away from some of the heavy tillage side of things to do the planting in the wide rows and the cultivation. We leave fields black in the wintertime, and wind and water erosion are much higher in that case, where if we leave roots in the ground, we really alleviate that. Both systems resulted in seed moisture of 12%, and the yield difference was assumed to be largely due to the plant population differences. So lastly, I would just want to leave you with some take-home messages from the entire presentation here. First and foremost, contact your potential buyers for market conditions, production contracts, and production barriers. You need to talk to these guys. They're going to help you grow. They're going to help you source seed. They're going to help you throughout the season. They're going to help you ultimately sell your product. You need to select a class and variety that matures in less than 100 days. Start with high germ, disease-free seed. Pick a well-drained field with low weed pressure, few rocks, and no herbicide carryover. Calculate seeding rates using 1,000 kernel weight and account for seed damage up to 25% if you're using an air seeder. Plant into soil temperature that is greater than 10 degrees with no risk of frost between May 20th to June 7th. Careful with compacting wet soils and soil crusting. Beans are weak at trying to emerge through that, and clay soils will definitely give grief for that. Land roll shortly after planting, before emergence. Early weed control is essential. They are not a very good competitor. If conditions are conducive for disease, apply fungicide preventatively prior to canopy closure. Swath or desiccate at 75% buckskin, less than 30% moisture. Allow leaves to drop for swathing. Attempt to hold the leaf zone with desiccating, as that helps with direct harvest. Harvest between 15 and 18% moisture to limit splits. Load hopper bottom bins with conveyors for short and long-term storage. I want to thank Sherilyn Phelps of the Saskatchewan Pulse Growers. She contributed to this presentation as well as facilitated. Amy Brown of Saskatchewan Crop Insurance Corporation was happy to help me out with stats from them. Joel Peru, Irrigation Agrologist, Saskatchewan Ministry of Agriculture, contributed some maps and some information. Dennis Lang, the Provincial Pulse Specialist, Manitoba Agriculture, also contributed information and pictures. Gary Nadowich, Irrigation Crop Diversification Corporation, contributed pictures and data for the projects. Kirsten Bett, breeder, University of Saskatchewan, gave me information on breeding and has been along helping with the presentation. Chuck Penner, Left Field Commodity Research, contributed all those graphs and is definitely a great resource for marketing information. Keith Nightingale and Blake Tebbett, both producers that were willing to share their experience in 2018. With that, I leave you with my contact information. If you're interested in more information, by all means, reach out to me by email, or I have a Twitter handle as well, which I'm fairly active on. If you follow me there, I often am sharing my experience here and different things with dry beans. With that, I think I'm complete.
Thank you, Jeff. That was a great presentation. Learned a lot on dry beans. As we start to have the questions typed in and coming in, I just want to remind people that are looking for their CCA credits that an email will be sent out to you after the presentation where you can then supply your CCA number. You also have the opportunity to provide suggestions for future webinar topics at the same time, so we do appreciate your feedback. This webinar, again, is recorded and will be posted on our website, as well as shared via Facebook and Twitter pages. So with that, we have a few questions and about 6 minutes or so to go through some questions before our end time at 2 o'clock. So the first question coming in is, how much of a grading factor and discounts are there when beans are left in the swath and they get rained on?
Okay, well, that's going to depend firstly on the type of bean that's there. If it's a black bean, for instance, there's probably going to be less effect. And it also depends on the maturity of it. If it's fully matured before it gets rained on or frosted, then it's probably going to hold its quality fairly well. Now, that being said, if the moisture continues to stay and molding becomes a problem, if it's moist and warm, then we could have issues with molding and rotting, and then your losses could be substantial. Now, when you get into the white beans, then your oxidation issues happen. And I've seen it before with pinto beans where they're left out for a significant amount of time and your grading factors will really come into effect. even to the point that they're unmarketable. So that's something you got to be considerate of for sure, that there will be likely some type of grading factor if left out in the conditions.
Thank you, Jeff. Next question is the sensitivity of the beans to hail damage.
I guess specifically, I haven't seen that in my own experience. Again, that will probably depend on what stage the hail is resulted in. But I would think it wouldn't be a whole lot different than other pulses as far as, again, you'd see defoliation. If there was podding, you may lose pods, things of that nature. The biggest thing will be the ability for disease to invade, and will have to be considered in that case.
On a similar topic, how fragile are beans, I guess, compared to other pulse crops in terms of the seed?
They are very far on the spectrum of delicate. Far and away more delicate than most others. Peas maybe in the past people considered to be very delicate. That seems to be been bred out of them. But when it comes to dry beans, it takes, especially as they get dry, the splitting, because they have the two sides to their seed, it takes very little, especially if there's any kind of damage to the seed coat, then they fall apart. But yeah, the biggest key is to keep the moisture up, and then your problems will be significantly less.
Okay. I have a comment here from Amy with crop insurance, just wanting everyone to be aware of that. Insurance on irrigated dry beans is across the whole province, and that the map restricting that area that kind of went up along the kind of northeast, from the southeast to the northwest, is for the dryland dry beans. So there is just a difference in the insurance that's offered for dryland versus irrigated. Back to Jeff, you talked a lot about the seed being fragile, and when you were talking about seed treatments, you were kind of cutting in and out, so maybe it's a chance for you to talk again about the need or whether dry beans need a seed treatment on them or not.
Okay, yeah. So seed treatment, yes, I recommend a seed treatment, basically for your soil-borne and seed-borne diseases. It's a good idea, I think, in any crop for that matter. The biggest thing with seed treatments is whether you're going to add that insecticide portion to it, and that is a judgment call on your own, whether you've had that problem with cutworms or wireworms in your crop in the past. So there is a few different options for sure. The other benefit of adding a seed treatment is it may help keep that seed intact because it moistens it up a little bit. But when you're doing that, you do have to consider the fact that you're probably going to have to get a commercial seed treater in if you're using your own bin run. In most cases, you're going to be buying certified seed, and they're likely going to give you the option as to what you want to be applied on there.
Okay. So speaking of insecticides on dry beans, there's a question that's come up regarding pea leaf weevils. Do they affect dry beans?
To my knowledge, no. That'll be something, though, that should be checked with somebody else for sure. I haven't seen that damage. And yeah, that would definitely be more, it's a little over my head, I guess, but I haven't seen that damage.
Okay. Possibly the last question here is you talk a lot about varieties and recommend that people really do some research on the varieties and choices that are out there. Where do you go to get your variety data? And is there variety data by region from Saskatchewan that can be used to make the decisions?
Yes. So the best stuff you can get your hands on is the regional plot data. SPG actually posts a combined analysis of that on their website, and they have a very formal production guide now posted on their website, so that's definitely worth reviewing, and that's where you can get varietal information that's specific. Now that does take into account all different regions. There is region-specific data. As far as accessing it, you may want to try and talk to an AgriArm site, or you may have to talk to the CDC specifically to get for that specific region. But in general, for Saskatchewan-based data, that's the avenue you want to take. So also the seed guide will have that data in there as well. Also, ICDC has their own varietal testing program. So they test very much the same varieties, but under irrigation conditions. And they do a wide row and a narrow row trial within. So you can find their data either on their website, which is irrigationsaskatchewan.ca, or search ICDC. Also, they do produce a varietal guide which has that information within. So there is good regional data to be looked at. It not necessarily is going to cover absolutely every variety, but hopefully going forward, there'll continue to be regional testing, and hopefully AgriArm sites will continue to be involved and evaluate those varieties.
Thanks, Jeff. One quick last question is regarding some maturity differences between CDC Blackstrap at 92 days, and what is the difference to CDC Marmot Pinto? What is the difference in days to maturity one can expect?
I believe Marmot is just slightly shorter. Without having the data in front of me, I want to say it's 89 or 90 days. Somewhere in that range, but Marmot is actually of the same genetics as Pintium, so which Pintium was super early, and Marmot is right in there with it. It's just a better genetic package, a little higher yield potential, but it is slightly before Blackstrap, and those two really are the two to consider when it comes to picking varieties, and it's a matter of picking the class.
Well, thank you. I think I speak on for everybody that was involved in listening to this webinar, that you presented a lot of great information. So thank you very much for speaking to us today. And thank Andrea again for organizing the session. And thank everyone who participated. And keep an eye open for our next webinar that we will be sending out in the relatively short period of time. It'll be available. It's coming up, I think, in January. So please keep your eyes open for that. So with that, thank you to everyone and have a great day.